If you've ever started an essay with a phrase like in life or throughout time, go ahead and raise your hand now. Or maybe you've taken the salesman approach with an opening like,
"We all have dreams. I know I do."
My name is Lusia Zaitseva and I teach writing at Harvard University. I'm also the founder of IvyWrite. And in today's video, I'm going to be telling you how you can build on the good skills you learned in high school in order to write an introduction befitting of the college student you will one day be or perhaps already are. Most of us were taught that your introduction needs to have a hook, because if you can't get your reader's interest in the very first sentence, they're not going to read your first paragraph, much less your second. Other than a hook, I bet if you've ever stepped foot inside of an English classroom, you know to put background information, outline your essay, and then state your thesis. Into the toaster for 5 minutes, and out comes your essay, right? Well, not really. While this is definitely not bad advice if you're just starting out, if you can handle those basics and you want a challenge, then there's a few things you need to know in order to not sound like you're trying to sell your reader an extended warranty on a car they don't own, and instead like you're trying to teach them in good faith something you yourself have learned. If we can be honest here for a moment, most high school teachers are thrilled if their students can even just string a basic sentence together with correct grammar and punctuation. And so if you can demonstrate a basic competence with the skills that the 5-paragraph essay is trying to teach you, your teachers will probably sleep soundly at night, even if they're not exactly jumping out of their seats every time your next paper drops. Because remember, your readers aren't always going to be patient professionals. Eventually, we all have to face the most daunting reader of all, the reader who can just put your essay down and go back to eating Fritos. Having a purposeful, non-formulaic introduction that nonetheless does all the things we need an introduction to do is a really important way that you can instill confidence in your reader so they'll actually want to come with you where you lead them. If you wouldn't take a stranger's hand if they came up to you on the street and said, "Follow me, I can't tell you where we're going or why," then don't expect your reader to either.
Walk this way.
Okay, let's start by talking about hooks, shall we? Sure, on the one hand, what better way to reel a reader in than by talking about life itself and existence, or the history of humanity, or perhaps a dramatic chain of big concept words strung together one after the other. A hook is essentially a gimmick that makes the reader want to keep reading. And it's great to demonstrate that we're thinking about our audience, because writing, like any communication, is inherently about the person you're speaking to, and if you're not taking their needs into account, then you're not doing a very good job. Not thinking about your audience when you write is kind of like putting a letter in a mailbox without an address and expecting it to get there wherever there is. But a gimmick can also be exactly what it sounds like, a cheap trick. Because if you start your essay with some grand provocation or a really lofty question, it sets the expectation for your reader that you're actually gonna address that question satisfactorily and reach some profound conclusion in your essay. And if we're being honest here, you're probably just trying to make it to lunch. Believe it or not, it's actually better for you and for your reader if you set out to do something a little bit less ambitious, but actually deliver on your promise. Don't feel like you have to make a grand pronouncement or reach some gigantic truth about what it means to be human in order for your essay to matter and be interesting to other people. It's kind of hard to take an author seriously when they're making grand sweeping statements or asking gimmicky questions when they don't already have a good deal of authority to begin with. And the people who have earned that kind of authority tend to be pretty judicious about what sweeping statements they make. So instead of thinking about hooks, here's my suggestion. Think about snags instead. You'll remember that from the video on thesis, which if you haven't watched yet, I'll link here. In other words, don't worry so much about trying to hook us. Instead, let us experience what it is that hooked you. The reason that's so much better than coming up with a gimmick is because a snag is an intellectually honest origin of your curiosity. It's the thing that made you pause in the first place, notice something, ask a good question about it, and the answer to that question became your thesis. And even if an essay prompt poses a question for you, that question will always be based on a snag of its own. And so instead of casting around frantically looking for a grand pronouncement more befitting of Sophocles than a sophomore, why not just stick to the snag you have? As I see it, you have basically two options with how to begin your introduction. You can either get down to business by telling us what your snag is, or you can throw us into the deep end by showing it to us. Let's look at some examples. In their essay, The Future is Faction, political scientists Stephen M. Tellis and Robert P. Salden begin, in recent years there has emerged a broad shared sense that political moderation is dying. As you can probably tell, they're taking the telling approach, and as scholars of American politics, they've earned their generalizations about what's been going on in recent years. Here's another great opening by Harvard professor and historian Robin Bernstein. In October 2009, Keith Bardwell, the Justice of the Peace in a Louisiana parish, refused to perform a wedding ceremony for Beth Humphrey, who's white, and Terrence McKay, who's African American. "I don't do interracial marriages," Bardwell explained, "because I don't want to put children in a situation they didn't bring themselves into." As you can probably see, she's using the showing approach, and it's really effective. As readers, our jaws drop to hear this anecdote, and also to learn that it took place in 2009, not 1950. And it really sets up perfectly a book that will be all about the way that children, childhood, and the idea of children have been used in various racial projects throughout the course of American history. Okay, you might be thinking, these are literal college professors. How can I ever hope to emulate them in my own writing? Well, of course you can. Take this opening sentence from an essay about Tellis and Salden's argument. In this case, the students simply wrote, in their essay, The Future is Faction, Professors Stephen M. Tellis and Robert P. Salden argue that political factions within America's two dominant parties is ultimately a better conduit to bipartisanship than introducing a third party onto the political landscape. This is a great opening sentence because even though it has no bells and whistles, it gets right down to the crux of the argument that the student will be engaging with, and they also save us some time, which we all, as busy readers, appreciate. If a reader doesn't care about politics, they'll put the essay down, and that's perfectly fine. Had this author started with, "The history of humanity is fundamentally one of struggle between opposing forces," or something like that, I promise the reader would be no more likely to stick around if they weren't interested in the topic, maybe even less so. The good sentence we saw a moment ago is matter-of-fact and self-confident rather than hand-wavy and frantic, which can't help but instill confidence in the reader. Now that we've talked about how to begin your essay, let's talk about how to end it. And this is the second big thing that differentiates a high school from a college-level introduction. In college, it's not enough to just put your thesis at the end of your introduction like you're checking it off your to-do list. It has to have stakes. This student essay, for example, does that really well, and so does this one. Now that we've gotten these two big things out of the way, let's clear up a few misconceptions. Students often think that they have to put their thesis in the first paragraph and their introduction can only be one paragraph. But the truth is, like in all communication, there are really no hard and fast rules, and the best practices vary by context and by the needs of the writer. But if you open any scholarly book, like Robin Bernstein's, which we looked at a moment ago, you'll notice that the introduction takes up a whole chapter. And that makes sense because if you're writing a few hundred pages, you've probably earned like 20 at the beginning. Yet even in her case, she puts the thesis on the top of, I think, page 4 in her introduction. And if she can do that, you can certainly introduce your 5-page essay in one paragraph. You might sometimes need 2 for a slightly longer essay, but I think as long as you're asking yourself, what's the soonest I can put my thesis in the essay and not confuse my reader, you're probably on the right track. And finally, while it's great to write your introduction as early as possible in the writing process, because it's also going to be a roadmap for you, not just your reader, as you set out to actually do the writing, as with any complex, sophisticated argument, it's very unlikely that you're going to game out all of the nuances before you actually get in the weeds with it, and you're probably going to be discovering some of the very best things there are to discover about your thesis when you actually get down to writing. That's why you have to go back later and rethink your introduction. You might even have to totally rewrite it. Why would you cling to your original introduction for dear life when your thoughts have actually progressed past it? So there you have it, some of the biggest things that differentiate high school and college level introductions. If you enjoyed this video, please help out the channel by subscribing and also sharing it with a friend. Next time, we'll get into some concrete ways of thinking about why your argument matters so you can really nail the stakes part of your introduction. See you then.